For nearly 75 years, hidden from the eyes of the world, the magical community was systematically tearing itself apart in 3 devastating wars, each one born from the dark, seductive dream of a single, terrible mind. Welcome. I am so glad you are here with me for this. Together, we are going to journey back into that shadow century, to understand not just what happened, but why it was allowed to happen, time and time again. These were not just battles of spells and curses, of bright flashes of light in darkened corridors. They were wars of ideas, of blood, of the very soul itself. They were civil wars fought in whispers before they were ever fought with wands. We will see how these conflicts began, not on some grand battlefield, but in the quiet, ambitious friendship of 2 brilliant boys, dreaming of a new world order during a single fateful summer, a dream that would fester into a nightmare, plunging an entire continent into a chaos that mirrored, and in some ways surpassed, the horrors unfolding in the non-magical world. It was a war that would end in the most legendary duel ever fought, but the ashes of that conflict would prove to be fertile ground. From them, a second, more insidious darkness would rise, a leader who learned all the wrong lessons from the first. So, let's find a comfortable space. Allow your mind to quiet down, to leave the present behind for a little while. There is no rush here. We have all the time we need to properly understand the weight of this history, to give it the respect and attention it deserves. Our story is a generational epic, stretching from the magical jazz and whispered secrets of the roaring 20s all the way to the fragile dawn of a new millennium. We will witness the rise of Gellert Grindelwald, a charismatic visionary whose silver tongue and terrifying power built a global campaign for wizarding supremacy. Then, we will descend into the suffocating, cold paranoia of Lord Voldemort's first reign of terror, a time when families were torn apart by suspicion and you could not trust the person standing next to you. And finally, we will stand with the last, ragged line of defense as that same Dark Lord returns to finish what he started, to extinguish the last light of hope. Because the stakes were never just about power or control. They were about the very definition of what it meant to be magical, and ultimately, what it meant to be human. It leaves us with questions that echo through the decades. How could one man's magnetic philosophy of power and prejudice nearly conquer the whole of magical Europe? What fatal flaw, what deep crack in the foundation of the wizarding world allowed a second, even more monstrous leader to rise so quickly after the first was defeated? And what is the secret connection, the almost unbelievable thread of destiny that links the fall of the first Dark Lord in 1945 to the impossible survival of a baby boy in 1981? The answers are not simple. They are woven into the very fabric of this hidden history, and together, we are going to pull on every single thread. Every great fire begins with a single spark. For the first global wizarding war, that spark was ignited in the minds of 2 brilliant, ambitious young men who dreamed of changing the world. Let's travel back to that ignition point. The year is 1899. The place, a small, sleepy village called Godric's Hollow, simmering in the oppressive heat of a long summer. The air is thick with the scent of cut grass and warm dust, the drone of insects a constant, lazy hum. But inside one house, the home of the historian Bathilda Bagshot, the atmosphere is anything but lazy. It is electric, charged with the frantic energy of discovery, and at the centre of it are 2 boys, not yet men, Albus Dumbledore and Gellert Grindelwald. They are surrounded by books and scrolls, their hands stained with ink, their voices low and urgent as they map out a revolution. They were more than just friends, they were intellectual equals, a rare and sometimes dangerous combination. For Albus Dumbledore, this summer was supposed to be a prison. At 18, on the cusp of a grand tour of the world with his friend Elphias Doge, he was instead called home by tragedy. His mother was gone, his father was locked away in Azkaban, and he was now the head of a broken family, responsible for his younger brother, Aberforth, and his deeply unwell sister, Ariana. Imagine for a moment you are this young Albus. You are a prodigy, perhaps the most brilliant wizard of your generation, but you are trapped by grief and duty, your own dazzling future seemingly extinguished before it can even begin. And then, into this stifling quiet, walks Gellert Grindelwald, He is charming, just as brilliant as you are, and he doesn't see your tragedy as a cage. He sees it as a reason for a better world. Grindelwald gave their ambition a name, a noble-sounding slogan that would one day be carved into the stone of a prison fortress. For the greater good. This was the core of his philosophy, the seductive logic he presented to the grieving and frustrated Dumbledore. It wasn't an argument for tyranny, not at first. It was an argument for responsibility. Let's explore what that meant to them. They saw the non-magical world tearing itself apart with its new industrial machines, its petty squabbles, its pollution, and its wars. They believed muggles were like children playing with fire, destined to burn down the house. Wizards, with their longer lifespans, their wisdom, and their power to heal and build in an instant, had a moral obligation to step in. It was their duty, they argued, to shepherd humanity, to guide it, to rule it for its own protection. But what, exactly, was the price of this benevolent protection? This is where the story takes its first dark turn. Because Grindelwald's vision of stewardship was absolute, it meant the end of the international statute of secrecy, the law that had hidden the magical world for centuries. It meant wizards emerging from the shadows to take their rightful place as the gentle, firm rulers of the planet. And for a young Albus Dumbledore, this idea was intoxicating. A world where his sister Ariana, whose magical abilities had been broken by a traumatic attack from Muggle boys, would never have to hide in shame again. A world where wizards would no longer have to live in fear. It seemed, in the heat of that summer, so very reasonable, so necessary. But his school, the Northern Institute of Durmstrang, had already seen the darkness coiling beneath Grindelwald's charisma. They had expelled him, not for poor grades or simple misbehavior, but for what the records call twisted experiments and near-fatal attacks on his fellow students. Durmstrang, a school with a notorious tolerance for the dark arts, had looked at this brilliant boy and seen something unacceptable, something dangerous. He arrived in Godric's Hollow not as an innocent scholar, but as a radical already cast out for his extremism. He was searching for something in that village, and it wasn't just an intellectual partner. He was hunting for legends, and at the heart of his and Dumbledore's shared obsession was a simple children's story from a book by Beadle the Bard, a fairy tale, they believed, that held the key to absolute power. The story was The Tale of the Three Brothers, and it spoke of three mythical objects: the Deathly Hallows. There was the Resurrection Stone, with the power to recall the spirits of the dead. There was the Cloak of Invisibility, which could hide its wearer from death itself. And then there was the third, the most coveted of all, the Elder Wand, an unbeatable dueling weapon. To possess all three was to become the Master of Death. To them, however, being the Master of Death wasn't about immortality. It was about invincibility. It was the ultimate tool to enforce their vision of the greater good. Think about the specific appeal of these objects to our two young revolutionaries. For Dumbledore, haunted by the death of his mother, the Resurrection Stone was a beacon of impossible hope. But for Grindelwald, it was always the Elder Wand. Power, the means to make the world bend to his will. We see here how a grand political ideology was born from intensely personal desires. This wasn't just a quest for control. It was a perverted quest for a world without pain, without loss, without weakness. Their letters from that summer, which we now have access to, are filled with this breathless, arrogant excitement. They saw themselves as philosopher kings, as righteous leaders destined to reshape civilization. Grindelwald's charisma was his primary weapon. He didn't inspire fear, not like the Dark Lord who would follow him. He inspired devotion. He made people believe that his vision of wizarding supremacy was not about hatred for muggles, but about love for wizard kind. It was a far more subtle and, in many ways, a far more dangerous form of prejudice. It was a poison sweetened with logic and righteousness, and Albus Dumbledore, for a time, drank it down willingly. But this intoxicating dream was built on a foundation of grief and denial, and reality was about to come crashing in. The voice of that reality was Albus's younger brother, Aberforth. He saw Grindelwald not as a saviour, but as a sickness infecting his brother's mind. Aberforth was a pragmatist. He was the one caring for their fragile sister day in and day out, while Albus and Gellert were busy planning their new world order. He saw their grand plans for what they were, the arrogant fantasies of two boys who were neglecting their most immediate and important responsibility. The tension in that house grew thicker than the summer heat, a storm building on the horizon. A confrontation was inevitable. What was the final, terrible event that would shatter their friendship and set them on paths of violent opposition? It was an argument, a furious, soul-scorching argument between the three of them. Aberforth, finally fed up, confronted Albus about his plans to leave with Grindelwald to begin their revolution, accusing him of abandoning Ariana. Grindelwald lost his temper. He saw Aberforth's love for his sister as a weakness, a sentimental anchor holding back a great man from his destiny. Wands were drawn. The small room erupted in a chaotic flurry of light and noise, a three-way duel born of rage and resentment. Albus was torn, trying to protect his brother from his friend, trying to protect his friend from his brother. And in the chaos, their sister Ariana, drawn by the noise and terrified, was caught in the crossfire. A flash of light, and she was gone. No one ever knew for sure whose curse it was that struck her down. In the deafening silence that followed, everything was broken. The friendship, the family, the dream. It all died on the floor of that room alongside the girl they were all, in their own ways, trying to save. It is a profound idea, isn't it? How an ideology designed to save the world for the greater good resulted in the destruction of one small, innocent life at its very conception. This was the brutal lesson that reshaped Albus Dumbledore's entire existence. The dream of two became the nightmare of one, and as Grindelwald left Britain, he began to gather the pieces for a war that would engulf a continent. While the non-magical world marched toward its own catastrophe, a parallel war was being waged in the shadows, a conflict of wands and whispers that destabilized Europe from within. The heartbroken boy who fled Godric's Hollow in 1899 did not simply vanish into obscurity. He did not mourn. He began to build. Let's move forward through time together, leaving the 19th century far behind us. We arrived decades later, in the 1930s, to witness what that seductive dream of the greater good has now become. The air across magical Europe is thick with tension, a low hum of anxiety that has nothing to do with the rumblings of the Muggle world. It is the sound of a gathering storm. Let's find ourselves for a moment in a hidden plaza in magical Paris, the stone archways invisible to non-magical eyes, the air tasting of ozone and a strange electric anticipation. We hear the collective breath of a vast crowd, not in an open stadium, but in a magically expanded amphitheatre hidden deep beneath the cobblestones, its ancient walls seeming to pulse with a dark, resonant energy. There are thousands here, wizards and witches from all across the continent, their faces upturned, rapt with attention. And then, a voice cuts through the charged silence. It is not a shout, but a calm, measured tone amplified by magic, a voice that seems to speak directly to the secret hopes and private fears each person holds in their own heart. This is Gellert Grindelwald in his prime. He stands on a simple stone dais, a figure of captivating charisma, his silver tongue weaving a new reality for his listeners. He doesn't speak of conquest or domination. He speaks of freedom. He speaks of pride. He argues, with devastating logic, that the international statute of secrecy is not a shield for their protection, but a cage built by the fearful to keep them hidden and ashamed. He paints a breathtaking picture of a world where wizards could finally walk openly, their powers a celebrated gift, using their wisdom to heal a broken world and guide it toward a better future. It was a message of liberation, and people were listening. His strategy was one of insidious persuasion. His followers were not called soldiers or warriors. They called themselves acolytes, and they spread his message not with threats and curses, but with secret meetings in hushed back rooms, with enchanted pamphlets that appeared on cafe tables, and with whispered conversations that turned the disillusioned and the resentful. Let's try to understand the appeal of this. Let's place ourselves in the mind of a German wizard in 1935. From a hidden window, you watch the non-magical world outside preparing for another brutal, senseless conflict, led by loud, angry men promising national glory. The official magical government tells you that your only duty is to do nothing, to stay hidden, to let the Muggles destroy themselves if they must. And then you hear of Grindelwald. He offers strength. He offers pride. He offers a solution. It is a terrible choice, isn't it? To remain a hidden victim of circumstance, or to join a movement that promises you your rightful place in the world. From these small, clandestine meetings, the movement began to grow exponentially. We can pull back from that single wizard's window and look upon a magical map of Europe. We see Grindelwald's chosen symbol, that triangular mark of the Deathly Hallows, begin to appear like a creeping stain across the continent. First it blooms in Austria, then it spreads its tendrils into Germany, France, and Spain. His was a conquest of hearts and minds long before it was ever a conquest of territory. He was winning the war before the first significant spell was even cast. He understood something fundamental about power. It is not taken by force. It is given freely by those who believe they have no other choice. And what of the established ministries of magic during this slow-motion collapse? They were, for the most part, paralyzed. The entire structure of their governments was predicated on one single principle: maintaining secrecy at all costs. Grindelwald was a master at exploiting this singular weakness. Any direct, large-scale magical confrontation with his forces risked exposing the wizarding world entirely. This was the one thing they feared more than Grindelwald himself. So they issued strongly worded warnings from mahogany desks. They arrested a few low-level followers to make a show of force. They did everything except face the leader himself. They were trying to fight a philosophical fire with bureaucratic paperwork. It was never going to be enough. As his power swelled, he began to construct a monument to his ideology, a physical manifestation of his new world order. High in the Austrian mountains, he raised the fortress of Nurmengard. This was not a castle built for defense or beauty. It was a prison, a bleak and terrible statement carved into the living rock. It was a place designed to hold his enemies, a grim promise of what would happen to those who opposed his vision of the future. And over its towering entrance, he had his infamous motto etched into the stone for all to see: for the greater good. The seductive phrase whispered between two boys in a quiet summer home had now become the justification for iron bars and stone cells. The dream was hardening into a nightmare. Grindelwald was more than just a charismatic speaker. He was a seer, gifted with glimpses of the future. He showed his followers visions of the coming Muggle World War, images of cities turned to rubble and fields scorched by fire, presenting them as undeniable proof that Muggles could not be trusted with the stewardship of the planet. He recruited all manner of followers, from pure-blood supremacists who already believed in his cause, to the downtrodden and marginalized who were simply desperate for a leader who saw their worth. He even gathered dark creatures to his side, promising them rights and recognition that the established wizarding world had long denied them. His army was not just an army, it was a coalition of the forgotten. His influence became undeniable, a dark tide rising across Europe, sweeping away old allegiances and installing a new, fervent loyalty. Yet one island nation remained conspicuously, stubbornly untouched. His acolytes found very little purchase in Britain. His name was spoken there only in hushed, fearful tones in the corridors of power. It was an anomaly on the map of his influence. With all this power at his command, with his vision of a global order, why did he never try to conquer Britain directly? What, or perhaps who, was holding him back from seizing the one country that seemed to be the heart of the opposition? The answer, as the whole world knew, was Albus Dumbledore. In the decades that had passed since that terrible summer, Dumbledore had become a titan in his own right. He was no longer a grieving, conflicted boy, but the revered Transfiguration professor at Hogwarts, a mentor to a new generation, and widely considered to be the most powerful and brilliant wizard of the age. He openly and consistently spoke out against Grindelwald's philosophy in academic papers and public forums. He was the natural leader for any organized resistance. He was, everyone agreed, the only one who could possibly match Grindelwald in a duel. The wizarding world, from Paris to Warsaw, looked to one man for salvation. Every day, the question grew louder in the halls of the ministries and on the front pages of newspapers like the Daily Prophet. Why won't Dumbledore fight him? The inaction was baffling. It was inexplicable. especially as Grindelwald's forces grew stronger, bolder, and more violent with each passing month. The world pleaded for a champion to step forward, for the duel of the century that could end the war, but Dumbledore could not move against him. He was a general who could not take the field. A single wizard stood as the ultimate obstacle, but a magical promise, a blood pact made in youth, kept the world's greatest champion from entering the fight. History remembers 1945 as the year the World War ended, but in the magical world it is remembered for a single, titanic duel that decided the fate of generations. For years the global community had been pleading, begging for Dumbledore to act, and for years he had refused. This wasn't cowardice. It was something far more intimate, a magical bond forged in the fires of that long-ago summer. It was a blood pact. Let's be very clear about what this was. It was a binding, unbreakable vow made between two young men who saw each other as brothers, a promise sealed not just with words but with their very lifeblood, magically preventing them from ever moving against one another. To attempt to do so would have meant their own death. This was the shackle Dumbledore carried in secret. A promise made out of love was now protecting a monster from justice, and for years that magical lock held firm. But as Grindelwald's war escalated, as his atrocities became too monstrous to ignore, the very nature of that pact began to fray. Dumbledore, with his profound understanding of magic, must have realized a terrible truth. Their actions were already harming each other, just indirectly. Every life Grindelwald took was a blow to Dumbledore's soul. The pact, a charm meant to prevent direct harm, was being corroded from the inside out by the consequences of their opposing philosophies. He knew he had to be the one to finally break it. So he went. He finally sought out the man he had avoided for nearly half a century. We are not in a grand hall or a public square for this. We are somewhere else, somewhere private, a place stripped of all ceremony. The air itself seems to hold its breath, thick and heavy with unspoken history. Here they stand, two old men who were once boys dreaming of changing the world, their faces etched with the paths they chose. They are the two most powerful wizards alive, and only one can walk away. What follows is not an exchange of simple curses. It is a violent, 3-hour conversation spoken in the language of pure power. Let's try to sense the sheer weight of this moment. Every spell Dumbledore casts is an apology for the past, an act of penance for his own youthful arrogance. Every shield he conjures is a defense of the world he once conspired to dominate. This is a duel of ideology. It is Dumbledore, spell by spell, dismantling the twisted logic of the greater good, with the brutal reality of its cost. The ground beneath them trembles, not from explosions, but from the raw, untamed magic being unleashed. And if we shift our perspective, just for a second, we can view this battle from the point of view of the one object that understands power better than anyone. Let's feel this from the perspective of the Elder Wand itself. For decades, it has known the grip of Gellert Grindelwald, his ambition, his fiery certainty, his rage. But now, it feels a different power answering it, a power that is quieter, deeper, a strength not of domination, but of acceptance. The wand feels Dumbledore's grief. It senses his profound understanding of loss and his respect for the boundary of death, the very thing he and Grindelwald once sought to conquer. It recognizes a mastery that goes beyond mere strength. It is a mastery born of wisdom and regret. The wand, an artifact that only respects power, is witnessing the definition of power itself being rewritten, and in that moment its allegiance begins to shift. It feels a new, more deserving master. The final moments of the duel are a blur of exhaustion and desperate energy. Dumbledore sees his opening. With a final, decisive movement, he disarms Grindelwald. There is no killing curse, no act of vengeance. Simply the sight of the Elder Wand flying through the air, leaving its master's hand and arcing towards its new one. The war was over. Dumbledore stood victorious, the Elder Wand now his. It was a victory that would cement his legend across the globe. But for him, it was a moment of profound tragedy. He had defeated the spectre that haunted Europe, but he had also defeated the brilliant boy he had once loved. Grindelwald was captured, taken to the highest cell in the very prison he had built. He would spend the rest of his days locked away in Nurmengard, with the hollow promise of his own motto carved in stone above the entrance. The world celebrated a hard-won peace. Yet Dumbledore now carried a terrible burden. He held the most dangerous weapon in existence, a wand won through conquest, and he was now the keeper of secrets that could shatter his heroic reputation. Grindelwald was defeated, but his ideology of supremacy and prejudice was not destroyed. That poison was now loose in the world, seeping into the ground, waiting for new roots to take hold. As one Dark Lord was locked away, another was just leaving school. A quiet, charming boy with a notebook full of secrets and a soul already splintered. The evil that followed Grindelwald was different. It wasn't born of grand philosophy. It was born of a deep, personal wound, a fear of death and a hatred of his own mixed heritage. Here's where the story takes a turn from the grand stage of global ideology to the dark, claustrophobic corridors of a single, poisoned mind. The second great darkness of the 20th century did not begin with a rally, but with the quiet scratching of a quill in a student's diary. It was an evil that incubated for decades in the heart of the one place the wizarding world considered its safest bastion, the school of Hogwarts itself. We must first understand the boy, Tom Riddle. He was an orphan, raised in a bleak, non-magical institution where he was seen as a strange and unsettling child. When he arrived at Hogwarts, he was a revelation preternaturally gifted, handsome, and impeccably charming. He became a prefect, then head boy, earning the adoration of nearly every professor. But beneath this polished surface was a chasm of cold ambition, a furnace of resentment fueled by the shame of his parentage. He despised his common Muggle father who had abandoned his witch mother, and he loathed the very name he carried. Tom. It was a mundane name for a boy who knew, with absolute certainty, that he was destined to be anything but mundane. And what terrible steps would a boy like that take to remake himself entirely? His quest for a new identity led him deep into the school's secret history, to the discovery of his own exalted bloodline. He was the last living descendant of Salazar Slytherin, one of the founders of Hogwarts. This knowledge didn't just give him pride, it gave him a target for his hatred. It confirmed his belief that the Muggle blood in his veins was a contamination, a stain he had to purify through power. While his classmates practiced charms and worried about exams, Tom Riddle was combing through the darkest, most forbidden texts in the library's restricted section, searching for a power beyond any taught in the curriculum. He was hunting for the secret to eternal life. What he found would set the wizarding world on a path to ruin for the next 50 years. Picture this for a moment. We are in the cozy, cluttered office of Professor Horace Slughorn in the winter of 1943. The fire crackles merrily, casting a warm amber glow on overstuffed armchairs and the gleaming surfaces of potion vials. The air smells of crystallized pineapple and wood smoke, a picture of comfort and safety. A small group of Slughorn's favourite students, his Slug Club, are gathered here, but one by one they depart until only his most brilliant protégé remains. 16-year-old Tom Riddle, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight, leans forward with a practiced, deferential air. He begins to ask about a piece of magic so obscure, so profoundly evil, that Slughorn believes it to be only a rumour. The professor's jovial mood evaporates, replaced by a sudden, clammy fear. The question Tom asks hangs in the warm air like a shard of ice. He asks about Horcruxes. This changes everything we thought we knew about the nature of life and death in the magical world. A Horcrux is an object in which a wizard has hidden a fragment of their soul. It is a perversion of nature, a violation of the deepest laws of magic. As long as that fragment exists, safely housed outside the body, the creator cannot truly die. Even if their physical form is destroyed, their splintered soul remains tethered to the mortal plane, a ghostly and diminished thing, but a thing that can, with time and the right dark magic, be restored. It was the ultimate answer to Tom Riddle's deepest, most primal fear. He could not be killed, and if we sit with that for a moment, we can feel the sheer gravity of this discovery. This isn't a spell for power or control like those Grindelwald sought. This is a spell to conquer mortality itself. But what is the cost of such an unnatural form of immortality? The soul, we are told, is meant to be whole, a sacred and inviolate thing. To split it is an act of supreme violence, an act of self-mutilation on a spiritual level. And there is only one way to perform such an act. One must commit the ultimate transgression. One must commit murder. Let's scale down from the continental war that Grindelwald waged, with his armies and his grand pronouncements, to the grotesque intimacy of this single act. Murder, in this dark calculus, is not merely the taking of a life. It is the mechanism. It is the spiritual cataclysm that rips one's own soul apart, and the wizard must then use that moment of violation to magically encase the torn fragment into an object of their choosing. The process itself is shrouded in the darkest of secrecy, but we can begin to sense the psychological state required to even contemplate it. One must see another person's life not as a life at all, but as a resource, a key to be used to unlock a door and then to be discarded. This was the chilling dedication Tom Riddle possessed. And as he pressed the horrified Professor Slughorn for more information, he revealed the true scope of his monstrous ambition. He didn't just want to create one Horcrux. He brought up the significance of the number 7, the most powerfully magical number. What would happen, he mused, if one were to split their soul not once, but 6 times, creating a 7-part soul? Slughorn was so appalled by the very idea, by the concept of a soul so mutilated and debased, that he refused to answer, shutting down the conversation entirely. But the damage was done. The seed of an idea had been planted and confirmed. Riddle now had his path forward, a grotesque ladder to immortality built from the lives of others, and he had already begun to climb. Even before that conversation, he had put the theory into practice. He had used his unique ability to speak to snakes to unlock Slytherin's hidden chamber of secrets deep beneath the school. From it, he unleashed an ancient basilisk, a monstrous serpent whose gaze meant instant death. He used it to murder a fellow student, a girl named Myrtle Warren, in a girl's bathroom. Her death was the act of violation he needed. He then tore a fragment from his 16-year-old soul and embedded it within his own school diary. The book became the first of his anchors to life, a secret weapon filled with a living memory of his younger self, a dark miracle of his own making. How could anyone possibly fight an enemy whose very soul was hidden away in pieces? After leaving Hogwarts, Riddle vanished from the public eye for a decade. He took a menial job at a dark arts shop called Borgin and Burke's, a position far beneath his talents, but one that gave him unique access. It allowed him to seek out and acquire objects of immense historical and magical value, items once belonging to the very founders of Hogwarts. He charmed an elderly witch named Hepzibah Smith, a descendant of Helga Hufflepuff, only to murder her and steal 2 of her greatest treasures, Hufflepuff's cup and Salazar Slytherin's locket. These were not just random thefts, they were strategic acquisitions. He was collecting trophies from the very history he sought to dominate, defiling them by turning them into containers for his fractured soul. He was not just ensuring his immortality, he was building a new identity out of stolen legacy. During this time, he also travelled far and wide, delving deeper into the dark arts than perhaps any wizard in history. He was experimenting, changing, pushing the boundaries of what it meant to be human. With each murder and each new Horcrux, a piece of his humanity was stripped away. The handsome, charming boy began to physically transform. His features became waxy and distorted, his face more serpentine, his eyes glowing a terrifying feral red. The name Tom Riddle was ritually abandoned, a relic of the pathetic half-blood boy he so despised. In its place, he forged a new name, an anagram of his old one. I am Lord Voldemort. It was a declaration of his rebirth, a name designed to inspire fear, a name that wizards would one day become too terrified to even speak. And he was not alone. Where Grindelwald had acolytes, drawn to an ideology, Voldemort began to gather followers of a different sort. They were not believers, they were supplicants. During his time at Hogwarts, he had already formed a gang of Slytherin students, a group of arrogant purebloods who were drawn to his power and his charismatic cruelty. These boys with names that would become infamous, like Lestrange, Avery, and Nott, were the seeds of a new organization. He called them his Death Eaters. The name itself reveals the core of his philosophy. They were not fighting for a greater good. They were fighting to master death itself, to command it, to deal it out on their own terms. They were a cult of personality, bound not by shared principles, but by a shared fear and awe of their seemingly immortal leader. This is the fundamental difference that made Lord Voldemort so much more terrifying than his predecessor. Grindelwald, for all his evil, operated on a plane of political and social philosophy. One could, in theory, argue against his ideas, debate his twisted logic. But how do you argue with nihilism? Voldemort's goal was not to build a new world order. It was simply to remove every obstacle, human or magical, that stood in the way of his personal, eternal reign. He didn't want to govern the world, he wanted to haunt it forever. His was a more modern and intimate form of terror, a suffocating evil that didn't just want your allegiance, it wanted your very soul. He promised his followers power over others, but he offered them no future beyond servitude to his own endless existence. With his soul anchored to the world in multiple hidden locations, Voldemort was now something entirely new in the history of dark magic. He was a man who had systematically dismantled his own soul to become a monster, all to escape the one fate every other living creature must eventually face. He was an immortal tyrant in waiting, a wound on the world that could never truly be healed. The 1950s and 60s were a time of quiet incubation, of gathering strength in the shadows, of placing the pieces on the board for a new and terrible game. With his soul anchored to the world, Voldemort was ready to emerge from the shadows. The 1970s would mark the beginning of a decade of terror. This was not a war of armies and battle lines. It was a war of whispers, disappearances, and the constant gnawing fear that your neighbor, your friend, even your family might not be who you thought they were. The 1970s began with a tremor, a subtle vibration of dread felt just beneath the surface of everyday life. In the non-magical world, it was a decade of loud rebellion and vibrant change, but in the wizarding world of Britain, a chilling silence was beginning to fall. Lord Voldemort had emerged from the shadows, and his methods were unlike anything the country had ever known. This was not a public campaign for hearts and minds like the one Grindelwald had waged across Europe. There were no charismatic speeches, no grand rallies, no philosophical justifications offered to the public. Voldemort's war began in the dark. It started with an empty seat at the breakfast table, a colleague who failed to show up for work at the ministry, a friend who missed a planned meeting and was simply never heard from again. These were not declared battles, they were voids, sudden and inexplicable holes torn in the fabric of society, and into these holes fear began to pour. How does a community defend itself against an enemy who does not announce his presence but is known only by the absences he leaves behind? Soon the absences were given a horrific explanation. Let's place ourselves in a quiet wizarding village on a starless night. The only sounds are the rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Then, a sudden flash of green light is seen through a neighbour's window, a colour every witch and wizard knows instinctively as the colour of death. Moments later, a colossal luminous green skull hangs in the air above that home, a serpent slithering from its mouth. This was the Dark Mark. It was Voldemort's calling card, a symbol of terror that served as both a signature and a warning. The Death Eaters had been there. A family had been extinguished. It turned a private murder into a public spectacle of power, a silent broadcast telling everyone for miles around, "We can reach you anywhere. There is no home safe enough. There is nowhere to hide." The initial targets were strategic, chosen to cripple any potential opposition before it could even organize. Prominent ministry officials who spoke out against the rising darkness were the first to be eliminated. Then came the members of ancient and respected pure-blood families who refused to pledge their allegiance to Voldemort's cause. These were not just murders. They were public executions designed to prove that no amount of wealth, history, or political power could protect you. The message was clear and brutal. You are either with us, or you are erased. With each assassination, the will to resist in the halls of power began to fracture, replaced by a creeping, pragmatic terror. Who would be brave enough to speak out, knowing their words could sign their own family's death warrant? What followed this initial wave of strategic terror was in many ways even more destructive to the soul of the wizarding world. Voldemort and his Death Eaters began to employ the unforgivable curses not just as weapons, but as instruments of societal demolition. The Cruciatus Curse, which inflicts unimaginable physical pain, was used not to kill, but to break the minds of captives, leaving them insane, a fate many considered worse than death. It was a method of creating living ghosts, their hollowed-out existences serving as a constant, terrifying reminder of the cost of defiance. But it was the third curse, the most insidious of all, that truly brought British wizarding society to its knees. It was the Imperious Curse, a spell that grants the caster complete and total control over the victim. We must try to comprehend the societal poison of this one piece of magic. It meant the enemy was no longer an external force, a cloaked figure you might see in a dark alley. The enemy could now be anyone: the kindly old witch who ran the apothecary, the cheerful wizard who delivered the mail, the aurora assigned to protect you. Even your own spouse or child could become a puppet, their bodies moving and speaking normally while their minds were trapped behind their own eyes, screaming in silence as they were forced to betray everyone they had ever loved. Let's try to feel what that does to a community. Trust, the very bedrock of any functioning society, evaporates overnight. Every interaction becomes layered with suspicion. You stop speaking freely in the halls of the ministry, because the person at the next desk might be a spy against their will. You hesitate to invite friends into your home, because who can say with absolute certainty that they are still in control of their own actions? This was Voldemort's true genius. He understood that you do not need to conquer a castle if you can make the people inside tear it down themselves. He was not just fighting a war against the Ministry of Magic, he was fighting a war against the concept of trust itself. And without trust, a society is just a collection of frightened people locked in their own homes. The Ministry of Magic, the institution meant to protect its citizens, found itself completely outmaneuvered. At first, they tried to suppress the news, to control the panic, insisting these were isolated incidents. But as the disappearances mounted and the dark mark became a common sight, denial was no longer possible. They were facing an enemy who did not follow any known rules of engagement. How do you prosecute a suspect when you can never be sure if they acted of their own free will? How do you fight an insurgency that can recruit your own soldiers without them ever knowing? The legal system, built on concepts of intent and guilt, began to buckle under the strain. In their desperation, the ministry's response became as brutal as the threat they faced. Under the leadership of Bartemius Crouch Sr., the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, new powers were granted to Aurors. They were given authorization to use the unforgivable curses themselves in the field. It was a grim necessity, they argued, a way to fight fire with fire. But what happens when the guardians of the peace begin to use the very tools of the monsters they are hunting? The line between law and tyranny started to blur. Arrests were made on the basis of suspicion alone, and suspects were sent to the wizarding prison, Azkaban, without a trial. The government, in its frantic effort to survive, was sacrificing the very principles it was supposed to defend. Let's step away from the politics and into the reality of daily life during those years. Picture a family home in the late 1970s. The curtains are permanently drawn, not just for privacy, but to hide the light that might attract unwanted attention. Heavy bolts and magical enchantments are layered on every door and window. The cheerful crackle of the Flu network, once a portal to friends and family, is now a source of anxiety, often sealed off with bricks for fear of an unauthorized connection. The sound of an unfamiliar owl tapping at the window is enough to make your heart stop, your wand jumping into your hand before you even think. This was the new normal, a life of constant, suffocating vigilance. The paranoia we spoke of, this deep and abiding suspicion, must be reframed not as a weakness or a form of cowardice. It was a rational, logical response to an impossible situation. When the systems of society have failed, when your government is compromised and the enemy can wear any face, paranoia is simply a survival mechanism. It was this atmosphere that allowed Voldemort to dominate for so long. He had broken the spirit of the people. He controlled the nation not through military occupation, but through a masterful campaign of psychological warfare that turned every citizen into their own jailer. The world had shrunk to the size of your own fortified home, and the silence outside was more terrifying than any battle cry. Voldemort's power grew unchecked for over a decade. His Death Eaters, a core group of pure-blood supremacists and sadistic followers, operated with near impunity. He drew other dark creatures to his cause, offering giants and werewolves a place and a power that society had always denied them. His army was a coalition of the cruel and the outcast, all united under a leader who promised them the freedom to indulge their darkest impulses. He seemed unstoppable. He seemed eternal. In the face of such overwhelming terror, with the government in disarray and the populace paralyzed by fear, how could anyone possibly fight back? When the official channels of power fail, resistance must go underground. And so, Dumbledore, now an old warrior, assembled a small secret army to fight the darkness once more. In the darkest hour, hope is not a strategy, it's an act of rebellion, and for a few brave souls that rebellion was called the Order of the Phoenix. It was a secret society, reformed by Albus Dumbledore from the embers of his old war, a final, desperate line of defense in a country that was bleeding out from the inside. They were a whisper of defiance in a world that had become too terrified to speak above its breath. They operated from the shadows, because the shadows were the only place left to them. And their first meetings were a study in impossible courage, as they looked at the faces around the room, wondering which of them would be the next to vanish. Let's reach for an old, hidden photograph from that time. The magical image shifts and moves, the figures within smiling and waving back at us, frozen in a moment of defiant optimism. Here are James and Lily Potter, so young, so in love, their faces bright with a future they believe they are fighting for. There is Sirius Black, handsome and laughing, throwing an arm around his friend. We see the Longbottoms, Frank and Alice, two of the finest auras the Ministry had ever produced, their expressions determined and steady, and the Prewitt twins, Gideon and Fabian, raising a toast to the camera. They are all unaware of the fate that awaits them, a roll call of the doomed, each one a promise of a future that would never come to be. To join the Order was to accept your own death as a near certainty. Members were spies, guards, and frontline soldiers in a guerrilla war where the enemy held all the advantages. They had to follow the law, while the Death Eaters held it in contempt. They sought to capture, while their opponents sought only to kill. It was a war of attrition where they were impossibly outnumbered, and with every loss the flame of resistance flickered and dimmed. But what other choice did they have, when the alternative was to simply let the darkness win? The casualties began to mount with a sickening rhythm. The McKinnon family, wiped out in a single, brutal attack on their home, the dark mark left hanging over the smoking ruins as a warning to their neighbours. Dorcas Meadows, one of the most talented witches in the Order, was murdered by Voldemort himself, a testament to the threat she posed. The losses were not just strategic, they were personal, each one a fresh wound for the survivors. And then there were Gideon and Fabian Prewitt, cornered by 5 Death Eaters, who fought with such ferocity that it took all 5 to finally bring them down, a battle that became a grim legend among the resistance. These were not just names on a memorial, they were the pillars of the fight. Their removal was part of a calculated strategy to demoralize and dismantle the Order piece by piece. Edgar Bones, a great wizard and member of a prominent Ministry family, was butchered along with his wife and children. His sister, Amelia Bones, who would one day head the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, would carry the weight of that loss for the rest of her life. Dumbledore's army was shrinking, his resources were dwindling, and the long, dark years of the late 1970s seemed to offer no possibility of victory. He knew that a direct confrontation was a losing battle. Voldemort was too powerful, his soul too well protected. Hope, if it were to be found, would have to come from somewhere else entirely. It came on a cold, wet night in a dingy room above a pub. It arrived not as a battle plan or a new weapon, but as a prophecy. Albus Dumbledore was in the Hog's Head Inn, a place known for its grimy atmosphere and less than savoury clientele, conducting a job interview for the post of divination professor at Hogwarts. The candidate was Sybil Trelawney, a woman who seemed more eccentric than gifted. The interview was a failure, and Dumbledore, disappointed, was preparing to leave. And then, something shifted in the room. The air grew cold, and Trelawney's eyes rolled back in her head. Her voice, once misty and vague, dropped into a harsh, resonant tone that seemed to make the very floorboards vibrate. She spoke of the one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord. "A boy," she said, "who would be born as the 7th month dies. He would be born to parents who had thrice defied Voldemort, challenging him directly on 3 separate occasions and surviving. And she spoke of a power the Dark Lord would not know, a power the boy would possess in abundance." The prophecy concluded with a chilling, ambiguous statement that neither could live while the other survives. One of them would have to kill the other in the end. It was a sliver of light in the overwhelming darkness, the first real suggestion that Voldemort was not, in fact, eternal. But this moment of revelation was compromised from its very inception, for outside the door, a Death Eater spy, Severus Snape, was listening, pressing his ear to the wood. He heard the beginning of the prophecy, the part about the boy's birth and his parents, but was discovered and thrown out before he could hear the crucial final lines about the unknown power and the fated confrontation. He raced to his master with this fragmented intelligence, this half-truth that would prove to be more dangerous than any lie, and in doing so, he set in motion a chain of events that would consume them all. Voldemort, the ultimate master of his own destiny, became a slave to a few lines of a prophecy he did not even fully understand. His arrogance and his deepest fear, the fear of death, made him incapable of ignoring the threat. He began to search frantically for a child who fit the description, and he found 2. 2 magical boys, both born at the very end of July 1980. The first was Neville Longbottom, a pure-blood, son of the celebrated Aurors, Frank and Alice Longbottom. The second was Harry Potter, a half-blood son of James and Lily Potter, 2 of Dumbledore's most defiant and troublesome Order members. Voldemort had a choice to make, a decision that would seal not only the child's fate, but his own. It is a profound idea, isn't it? The prophecy was not a decree, it was a potentiality. Its power came not from the words themselves, but from the choice Voldemort made to believe them. He saw in the description of Harry Potter a dangerous parallel to himself, a half-blood of immense potential. It was this detail that tipped the scales. He chose the boy he believed was most like him, and in doing so, he began the process of fulfilling the prophecy himself. He decided to eliminate the threat of Harry Potter before he could even speak, convinced he was closing a circle of fate, when in reality, he was drawing it for the first time. The Potters were immediately alerted by Dumbledore, who understood the terrible gravity of the situation. They went into hiding, protected by the most powerful concealment charm known to magic, the Fidelius charm. This ancient and complex spell took a secret, in this case, the location of their home in Godric's Hollow, and embedded it within the soul of a single living person, a secret keeper. The location would then become magically undiscoverable to anyone, unless the secret keeper chose to divulge it. The family was safe, utterly and completely, as long as their chosen guardian remained loyal. Their choice for this sacred trust was their close friend, Sirius Black. But at the last moment, in a fateful decision designed to mislead the enemy, they switched. Sirius Black convinced them to use another of their friends, the quiet and unassuming Peter Pettigrew, arguing that Voldemort would never suspect such a seemingly weak and mediocre wizard. It was the perfect double bluff. But no one knew that Peter Pettigrew, terrified for his own life, had already become a spy for Lord Voldemort. He accepted the role of secret keeper, and in the same breath, he betrayed his best friends to their deaths. The most powerful shield of protection was rendered useless by the simplest act of human weakness. The end came with terrifying speed. Pettigrew gave Voldemort the address. The charm was broken, and the family's safe house was instantly exposed. Dumbledore's frantic last-minute warnings were not enough. Voldemort arrived in Godric's Hollow on Halloween night, walking through the quiet village streets, his black robes sweeping over the fallen autumn leaves, a figure of absolute death, moving towards a home filled with life and light. James Potter died first. trying to buy his family a few precious seconds to escape, wandless and utterly defenseless against the green flash of the killing curse. Voldemort then ascended the stairs to the nursery, where Lily Potter stood over her son's crib, her arms outstretched, forming the last and only barrier between the Dark Lord and the 1-year-old child. He offered her a chance to stand aside, a rare act of mercy prompted by a request from his spy, Snape, who had loved Lily since they were children. She refused. She begged him to take her instead, to kill her and spare her son. He laughed, and with a second flash of green light, she fell. Her sacrifice, an act of pure, unconditional love, was complete. And in that moment, she unknowingly invoked a magic older and more powerful than any Voldemort had ever conceived of. He now stood over the crib, his red eyes fixed on the infant with the messy black hair. He had defeated every obstacle, killed every guardian, and now all that was left was to extinguish this tiny, impossible threat. He raised his wand one last time, speaking the 2 words that had ended so many lives before. But the curse, the unstoppable killing curse that had never failed, did not work as it should. It rebounded from the child, striking the caster himself. How could a mother's love, a simple act of sacrifice, defeat the most powerful dark wizard of all time? The Dark Lord, armed with a prophecy, marched towards a small house in Godric's Hollow, convinced he was about to extinguish the one threat to his power. Instead, he was about to create it. The war was over. The monster was gone. But what if the peace that followed for 14 years was built on a terrible misunderstanding? What if the monster was not truly vanquished, but was only waiting, a disembodied spirit of malice, for the chance to rebuild himself, helped by the one thing more dangerous than fear: denial? We find ourselves now in a place of endings and beginnings, a dark and overgrown graveyard in a forgotten village called Little Hangleton. Let's listen to the sound of the night. There is the dry rustle of wind through brittle weeds, the distant cry of a hunting owl, and the low, guttural chanting of a dark ritual. A great stone cauldron bubbles over a roaring fire, its contents shimmering with an unnatural light. We hear a splash, as something solid, a bone from a father's grave, is dropped into the potion. Then comes the sound of a silver dagger slicing through flesh, and the whispered words of a servant sacrificing his own arm to the brew. And finally, the smallest, most vulnerable sound of all, a few drops of blood being drawn from the arm of a captive teenage boy. A final incantation is hissed into the night air. The potion flashes a blinding white-hot light, and from the cauldron, a new form begins to rise. It is skeletal at first, thin and frail, but it grows with terrifying speed into the shape of a tall, pale man with eyes as red as blood. He was a ghost. Now he was flesh. Lord Voldemort had returned. This moment of absolute triumph for the forces of darkness went completely unseen by the world. It was witnessed only by his most cowardly servant and his most hated enemy, the boy who had survived him, Harry Potter. While Harry barely managed to escape with his life and the terrible news, the wizarding world at large slept soundly, secure in a peace they had come to take for granted. The return of a Dark Lord is a difficult truth to accept. It is a truth so monumental, so utterly world-shattering, that for many, it was easier not to believe it at all. This collective refusal to see is what allowed the Second War to begin not with a bang, but with a silent, creeping infection of lies. This period, from 1995 to 1996, was a new kind of conflict. We can call it the Silent War. On one side was Albus Dumbledore and a single teenage boy, armed with a horrifying, inconvenient truth. On the other was the entirety of the magical establishment, led by a man who was not evil, but who was perhaps even more dangerous, a man terrified of losing control. Cornelius Fudge, the Minister for Magic, had spent his career presiding over an era of peace and prosperity. The story of Voldemort's return was not just a threat to his citizens, it was a direct threat to the stable, orderly world he had built his legacy upon. So he made a choice. He chose to believe it was a lie. His campaign against the truth was swift and devastatingly effective. Let's shift our perspective to feel the weight of his office, the heavy, polished wood of his desk, the endless stacks of official parchment. From this seat of power, Fudge saw not a returning Dark Lord, but a conspiracy. He reasoned that Dumbledore must be trying to destabilize his ministry, to seize power for himself. And Harry Potter? He was a disturbed and attention-seeking boy, a pawn in Dumbledore's grand game. It was a far more comforting narrative than the alternative. It was a problem that could be managed with policy and propaganda, not with a war. So, the Ministry of Magic, the very institution meant to be the shield of the wizarding world, became its greatest vulnerability. The Daily Prophet, once a source of news, became Fudge's personal mouthpiece, running a relentless smear campaign. Picture Harry Potter, a boy of 15, already grappling with the trauma of witnessing a friend's murder and the rebirth of evil itself. Now, he opens the morning paper to see his own face staring back at him under headlines that call him disturbed and dangerous. His friends at school whisper behind his back, their parents having told them to stay away from the unstable Potter boy. He was utterly alone with the terrible truth. He was a prophet no one would believe. Dumbledore, too, was systematically dismantled in the court of public opinion. He was stripped of his long-held positions, his seat on the Wizengamot, his role as chief warlock. His wisdom, once sought by all, was now framed as the ramblings of a man who had lost his grip on reality. It was an act of institutional self-blinding on a massive scale. The government was so afraid of causing a panic that it willingly blinded itself to the approaching tidal wave, assuring its citizens that the tide was, in fact, going out. This provided Lord Voldemort with his single greatest gift. It gave him time. While the ministry was busy discrediting the two people who knew he was back, Voldemort was quietly rebuilding. He was a general with an entire year to assemble his army on a battlefield where the enemy insisted there was no war. He began by consolidating his power among his most loyal followers. The Death Eaters, who had escaped justice after the First War by claiming they had been under the Imperious curse, were secretly recalled to his side. They moved with absolute freedom, their old allegiances unknown to the ministry that was so focused on Dumbledore. Their task was to sow the seeds of the coming takeover. He also knew he needed his most fanatical, most dangerous followers, the ones who had proudly gone to Azkaban rather than deny him. So he orchestrated a mass breakout from the wizarding prison, an event so audacious the ministry could not hide it. But even then, they spun the story, blaming the escape on the fugitive Sirius Black, the man they had wrongly imprisoned years before. Every move Voldemort made was either ignored or misinterpreted, his shadow growing longer while the ministry officials were busy looking at their own reflections. He was gathering giants from the mountains and werewolves from the fringes of society, promising them the power and respect they had always been denied. He was building a coalition of the dispossessed and the damned. Here's where the story takes a turn, because the ministry's war on the truth wasn't just fought in the newspapers. They decided they needed a presence inside Hogwarts itself, a watchdog to ensure that Dumbledore wasn't spreading his lies to the next generation. They sent a woman named Dolores Umbridge. Let's take a moment and step inside her new office at the school, a place she has redecorated to her own tastes. The air is thick with the cloying, sickly sweet smell of perfume. Everything is draped in pink lace and doilies. A collection of ornamental plates hangs on the wall, each one featuring a different gambolling kitten. The sensory experience is one of suffocating artificial pleasantness, a perfect mask for the deep bureaucratic evil that lay beneath. Umbridge represented a new kind of threat. She was not a Death Eater. She was the banal, smiling face of institutional cruelty. She arrived armed not with a wand, but with a stack of educational decrees, each one another brick in the wall she was building around the school's freedom. She began by monitoring all lines of communication, reading the students' mail. She disbanded all student groups and teams, and most critically, in her role as the new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, she refused to teach any practical magic at all. The curriculum she imposed, with the full backing of the ministry, was purely theoretical. The government was so committed to the idea that there was no threat, it was actively preventing the next generation of wizards from learning how to defend themselves. This act of willful negligence became the catalyst for a new rebellion. Harry, Ron, and Hermione, seeing the danger their classmates were in, formed a secret defense group. They called themselves Dumbledore's Army, a name that was both an act of loyalty and a defiant political statement. They met in a hidden magical room within the castle, and there Harry Potter, the boy the world called a liar, began to teach his peers real, practical defensive magic. He taught them how to cast shield charms, how to disarm an opponent, how to conjure a Patronus against the soul-sucking Dementors. He was preparing them for a war his government insisted did not exist. For many of these students, it was the first time they felt a sense of agency, of power, in a world that was becoming increasingly frightening and confusing. But while Harry was training his friends, Voldemort was becoming aware of a strange new connection between them. In the chaos of his own failed killing curse 14 years prior, a fragment of his soul had broken off and latched onto the only living thing in the room. Harry himself was an unintentional Horcrux, a secret Voldemort did not yet understand. This connection gave Harry terrifying, dreamlike visions into the Dark Lord's mind. He could feel Voldemort's rage, his triumphs, his desires. Dumbledore, realizing the danger, tried to sever this link, forcing Harry into grueling lessons in occlumency, the magical art of shielding the mind. But the connection was too deep, too powerful. Voldemort began to sense that he was being watched, and he realized he could use this mental bridge not just as a weakness, but as a weapon. He could plant false visions. He could lure Harry into a trap. The Silent War was a pressure cooker, and the steam was beginning to vent. The Ministry's official narrative was showing cracks. Too many strange things were happening. Too many whispers were circulating for the denial to hold forever. Fudge grew more and more paranoid, his grip on power feeling less secure with each passing day. He knew Dumbledore was his greatest political rival. He was convinced Dumbledore was building a secret wizarding army to overthrow him. When Umbridge finally discovered the existence of Dumbledore's army at Hogwarts, Fudge saw it as the final, undeniable proof of his conspiracy theory. He had found the evidence he was looking for, even if it was evidence of a crime that was never being committed. What event would be so public, so undeniable, that it would finally force the world to admit the darkness had returned? Fudge arrived at the school with auras, ready to arrest Dumbledore for treason. But Dumbledore, in a stunning display of power, disarmed them all in an instant and escaped. He became a fugitive, forced into hiding, leaving the school entirely in the hands of Umbridge and the Ministry. Harry was now more isolated than ever, his greatest protector gone, and Voldemort knew it was time to spring his trap. He sent a vision directly into Harry's mind, a clear and agonizing image of his godfather, Sirius Black, being tortured in a mysterious black-tiled hall deep within the Ministry of Magic itself. Harry believed it was real. He had to act. He and his friends flew to London, straight into the heart of the enemy's territory, to save a man who wasn't even there. A lie can only be sustained for so long, and deep within the Ministry of Magic itself, in a hall of prophecies, the Silent War was about to become terrifyingly loud. The Second Wizarding War had officially begun. This time, it was not a shadow war of terror. It was a coup, a complete takeover of the state where the institutions of magic were turned against its own people. The Ministry of Magic, once a symbol of order, fell in a single night. It was not a grand battle with explosions and rubble, but a silent, bloodless takeover, which in many ways was far more terrifying. Key department heads, already under the Imperious curse for months, simply walked aside. The protective enchantments around the building were dismantled from the inside, a quiet betrayal that sealed the government's fate. How do you defend against an enemy who already holds the keys to the castle? Let's find ourselves in the Ministry's grand central atrium, a place we once knew as a hub of bustling magical life. The sound is all wrong. The cheerful bubble of the Fountain of Magical Brethren is gone, replaced by a dead, echoing silence. The golden statue celebrating harmony between magical beings has been ripped from its foundations. In its place looms a new monument, a terrifying sculpture of black stone depicting a witch and wizard enthroned upon a mound of crushed, screaming muggles, their faces contorted in agony. The motto carved into its base is a chilling declaration of the New World Order. Magic is might. This was not just a change in leadership. It was a complete and venomous rewriting of their entire civilization's values. A puppet minister, Pius Thickness, was installed, his mind and will completely hollowed out by the Imperious curse. his every action dictated by Voldemort. But the true power, the smiling bureaucratic face of this new evil, belonged to Dolores Umbridge. She was placed at the head of a new department, the Muggle-born Registration Commission. Its stated purpose was to document those who had stolen magic from real witches and wizards. Its true purpose was to legally and systematically strip an entire class of people of their rights, their wands, and ultimately their freedom. It was ideological purification disguised as paperwork, a campaign of terror waged with ink stamps and court summons. Where could you run when the law itself was your hunter? The Daily Prophet, which had spent the previous year calling Harry Potter a liar, now became the regime's most powerful weapon. It no longer reported the news. It manufactured a new reality. Headlines celebrated the purity of magical bloodlines and printed lurid, fabricated stories about the dangers posed by Muggleborns. Photographs of so-called criminals, their faces pale with fear, were plastered on the front page, turning neighbours into informants and suspicion into a civic duty. The government and the media were now speaking with a single, unified voice, a constant, deafening drumbeat of hatred that made it almost impossible to hear the quiet voice of the truth. With every word they printed, they were building the walls of a national prison. This new ideology found its most fertile ground in the one place that should have been a sanctuary for all magical children, Hogwarts. With Dumbledore gone, the school was seized by the Ministry and placed under the control of two Death Eaters, the siblings Alecto and Amicus Carrow. Let's try to feel the shift inside those ancient castle walls. The warmth and laughter that once echoed in the corridors are gone, replaced by a cold, watchful silence. Every lesson became propaganda. Every act of defiance was met with torture. Your school was no longer a haven, but a prison. Imagine being a student there. The defense against the dark arts class is now just called the dark arts, and you are taught how to perform the Cruciatus Curse, with your fellow students as the targets for your practice. Muggle Studies is now a mandatory course that teaches the vile, state-approved history of Muggles as brutish, subhuman creatures who must be subjugated for their own good. The portraits on the walls whisper warnings instead of friendly greetings. The ghosts of the castle drift silently, their usual cheer replaced by a spectral gloom. It was a systematic effort to poison the minds of the next generation, to ensure that Voldemort's rule would be accepted not out of fear, but out of genuine belief. How could hope possibly survive in such a place? Yet, it did. Even in the heart of the occupied castle, a new resistance was taking root. Dumbledore's army was secretly reformed, this time led by Neville Longbottom, Ginny Weasley, and Luna Lovegood. They were no longer just learning defensive spells. They were waging a small, desperate war of their own. They wrote messages of rebellion on the castle walls, freed students from detention, and tried to protect the younger children from the Carrow's cruelty. Their acts of defiance were small, but in a world of total control, a single spark of rebellion can shine like a star. They were keeping the memory of Dumbledore, and everything he stood for, alive. They were a constant, painful thorn in the side of the new regime, a reminder that not everyone had been broken. Meanwhile, the remnants of the Order of the Phoenix were scattered and fighting for their very survival. They had become a true underground movement, communicating through coded messages and secret broadcasts on a pirate radio station called Potterwatch. They were hunted, their safe houses compromised one by one, their numbers dwindling with each passing week. They could not fight the Ministry's new army head-on. Their war was one of intelligence, of smuggling fugitives to safety, of trying to protect the innocent wherever they could. They were fighting to hold the line, to keep some semblance of the old world from being completely extinguished until a real chance for victory could be found. But with Dumbledore gone and the Ministry fallen, the world's only hope rested on a secret mission undertaken by 3 teenagers. But what, exactly, was it? This entire horrific transformation of society, from the Ministry's laws down to a child's textbook, was the horrific, logical endpoint of the pure blood supremacy that had festered for centuries. It was not a new idea. It was an old poison that had finally been given the power to consume the entire body of the wizarding world. It was the dream of Salazar Slytherin made manifest, a society purified of all that it deemed unworthy. The conquest was not just about territory or power. It was about creating a new kind of magic, a new kind of wizard, one defined not by their character or their choices, but by the supposed purity of their blood. While the world burned, while their friends and families were being hunted, tortured, or forced into hiding, Harry, Ron, and Hermione were far from the front lines of the war. They were on the run, living in a magically concealed tent, moving from one desolate forest to another, cut off from everyone they knew and loved. They were engaged in a desperate, seemingly impossible hunt. They were searching for the scattered, hidden pieces of Lord Voldemort's soul. Every story, every war, has an ending. For this century of conflict, it all came down to a single night, a single place. A school, defended by its students, its teachers, and its ghosts. The hunt for the pieces of Voldemort's soul had led Harry, Ron, and Hermione back to the one place he believed he owned, the fortress of his new regime, Hogwarts. There, hidden within the castle's ancient walls, lay one of the final anchors to his immortal life. And to reach it, they would have to walk directly into the heart of the enemy's power. But they would not be walking alone for much longer. A call for aid went out into the night, a desperate whisper carried on the wind, and from the shadows the resistance answered. The scattered remnants of the Order of the Phoenix began to appear in the halls of the school, their faces grim and weary, but their wands held steady. They were joined by the older students of Dumbledore's army, teenagers who were now being asked to become soldiers in a war their government had told them was already lost. The great hall, a room normally filled with the cheer of feasts and floating candles, was transformed. We can hear the scraping of benches being moved into barricades, and the hushed, urgent tones of strategy being discussed under the enchanted ceiling. They had hours, perhaps only minutes, before the siege would begin. The castle itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Outside, an army of darkness was gathering at the edge of the forbidden forest, a silent, numberless mass of Death Eaters, giants, and Dementors, their presence a suffocating weight on the very air. The defenders of Hogwarts knew what they were facing. They were a skeleton crew, a handful of fighters standing against a tidal wave of pure hatred, and every single one of them knew they might be seeing their last dawn. Yet in that hall, we can sense something stronger than fear. It was a cold, hard resolve. This was their home, and they would not let it fall without a fight. And then, the voice of Lord Voldemort echoed through the castle, a high, cold sound that seeped through the stone itself, a voice that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the mind. He gave them an ultimatum: surrender Harry Potter, and no one else would be harmed. He gave them 1 hour. In that moment, the choice of a lifetime was presented to every person within those walls. Not a single soul moved to betray the boy who stood among them. The battle for Hogwarts had begun before the first spell was ever cast. It began with an act of collective, unspoken loyalty. The hour expired, and the night erupted. The sound was a physical blow, the roar of 1,000 destructive spells striking the castle's magical shields. A percussive blast of light and fury that made the ancient stones groan. From the ramparts, professors and students answered with a volley of their own, streams of red and gold light arcing into the darkness, a desperate but defiant reply. The battle was joined, a chaotic symphony of explosions, shattering stone, and the distant, terrible screams of the dying. Amid this vast, terrifying conflict, 3 teenagers slipped away from the main fight. Their war was not on the castle walls. It was a race against time within them. While their friends and teachers fought for their lives, Harry, Ron, and Hermione were hunting for a ghost's treasure, the lost diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw. They moved through corridors, shaking with the force of the battle, the flashes from the windows, illuminating scenes of desperate duels in the courtyards below. They knew it was somewhere in the castle's secret room of lost things, a vast, cathedral-like space filled with the forgotten junk of 1,000 years of students. To find one small object in that sea of refuse while a war raged around them seemed an impossible task. They were looking for a needle in a collapsing haystack. The diadem was found, a beautiful, delicate thing corrupted by the sliver of soul it now contained. But destroying it unleashed a cursed fire, a living inferno that consumed the entire room, roaring with the sound of a ravenous beast. They escaped by seconds, leaving the Horcrux to be annihilated in the flames it had created. One piece was gone, but another remained. And as they emerged, gasping, into the main battle, the true cost of their private war became devastatingly clear. The bodies of the fallen were now being carried into the Great Hall, laid out in rows upon the floor. Fred Weasley, Remus Lupin, Nymphadora Tonks, friends, brothers, teachers. The price of this fight was written on every pale, still face. The battle paused, a temporary lull as Voldemort recalled his forces, a cruel intermission in the slaughter. It was in this sudden, eerie quiet that Harry's attention was drawn to the shrieking shack at the edge of the grounds. He witnessed Voldemort's final, terrible act of strategic cruelty. The Dark Lord, believing the Elder Wand was not giving him its full allegiance because its last master was Severus Snape, unleashed his monstrous snake upon his most faithful servant. As Snape lay dying, his lifeblood pooling on the dusty floor, he locked eyes with Harry and gave him one last gift. It was a memory, a silvery thread of thought pulled from his mind. It was the key to everything. Harry returned to the headmaster's office, the sounds of grief from the great hall echoing behind him. He poured Snape's memory into the stone basin of the Pensieve and plunged his face into its swirling silver surface. He was not just watching a memory, he was living it, standing unseen as the secret history of the last 17 years unfolded around him. He saw Snape's childhood love for his mother, Lily. He heard Snape begging Dumbledore to protect her. He witnessed the terrible bargain Snape made after her death, agreeing to become a double agent, a spy in the heart of the darkness, all in the name of the woman he had loved. And then he heard a conversation between Dumbledore and Snape, a quiet, devastating discussion of the final plan. This changes everything we thought we knew about the boy who lived. Dumbledore explained that when Voldemort's killing curse rebounded all those years ago, it did not just leave a scar. A fragment of Voldemort's own soul, shattered by the curse's failure, had latched onto the only other living thing in the room. Harry Potter was never just a boy who survived. He was the seventh Horcrux, the one Voldemort had never intended to make. And Dumbledore's final instruction to Snape was delivered with a terrible, quiet finality. When the time was right, the boy, Harry Potter, must be told. He had to die. And so, the greatest weapon the Order of the Phoenix ever had was not a spell or a secret plan. It was a boy who had been raised like a pig for slaughter. Let's try to process the sheer weight of this revelation from Harry's perspective. Your entire life, your identity as the chosen one, the survivor, has been reframed in an instant. Your destiny is not to kill the Dark Lord. Your destiny is to let him kill you. This is the only way to destroy the final piece of his soul, the piece that resides within your own body. All the sacrifices of your friends, all the deaths in the hall below, would be for nothing unless you willingly walked into the arms of your murderer. This is where the scale of the war shifts, from the grand battle raging across the castle grounds down to the silent, internal war being fought in the mind of a single boy. He walked out of the office, his decision made. He pulled his invisibility cloak around him, not to hide, but to ensure no one would try to stop him from what he had to do. His journey across the grounds was a pilgrimage through the wreckage of his own life. He saw the devastation, the broken bodies of people he knew, and each one was another reason to continue. This was not a walk of despair. It was not an act of surrender. We can see now that this was an act of ultimate power, a choice made not from weakness, but from a love so profound that it was willing to pay the ultimate price. This was a reframing of what victory truly meant. He reached the edge of the forbidden forest and let the cloak fall from his shoulders, revealing himself. He walked into the clearing where the Death Eaters were gathered, their faces a mixture of shock and cruel glee. And there, at the center of them all, was Voldemort, his red eyes widening in triumph as his enemy simply gave up and came to him. Harry looked at the man who had murdered his parents, his friends, the man who had haunted his every waking moment, and he did not raise his wand. He just stood there, waiting. Voldemort raised the Elder Wand, the most powerful weapon in existence, and with a scream of pure hatred, he cast the killing curse. A flash of green light filled the world, and then there was only silence and darkness. But it was not the end. Harry awoke in a place that was not a place. A vast, white, silent space that felt like King's Cross Station, bathed in a clean, heavenly light. And there, waiting for him, was Albus Dumbledore. It was here, in this realm between life and death, that the final mechanics of magic were laid bare. Dumbledore explained that Lily's sacrificial protection still lived on, not just in Harry's skin, but in Voldemort's own veins, because he had used Harry's blood to rebuild his body. This tethered Harry to life. The killing curse had destroyed the part of Voldemort's soul that lived in Harry, but it had left Harry's own soul untouched. The boy was now free of the Dark Lord's influence. Dumbledore went on to explain the final piece of the puzzle, the Elder Wand. The wand's allegiance was not won simply by murder, but by defeat. When Draco Malfoy had disarmed Dumbledore on the tower that night, he had unknowingly become the wand's true master. And later, when Harry had physically taken Draco's own wand from him, the Elder Wand's allegiance had shifted again, this time to Harry Potter. Voldemort had been wielding a wand that was not, and never would be, truly his. It answered to the very boy he was trying to kill. Harry was given a choice. He could board a train and move on to whatever lay next, or he could go back to finish the fight. He chose to go back. He woke up on the forest floor, surrounded by the stunned silence of the Death Eaters. They believed he was dead, a trophy to be displayed. He was carried back to the castle in a grim procession, his body laid at the gates as Voldemort declared his final victory to the horrified survivors. But as the sun began to rise, a new defiance stirred. Neville Longbottom stood forth, pulling the sword of Godric Gryffindor from the Sorting Hat. The snake, Nagini, the last Horcrux, was destroyed in a single, flashing blow. In that moment of chaos, Harry threw off the pretense of death, and the final battle was joined, not as a war, but as a last, desperate duel in the center of the Great Hall. It was just the two of them now, circling each other. Harry explained it all, the truth of the wand, the failure of his power, laying bare every secret. Voldemort, consumed by his own pride, could not comprehend a power that did not involve force. He cast the killing curse one last time, at the wand's true master. At the same moment, Harry cast a simple disarming charm. The Elder Wand would not kill its own master. It turned Voldemort's curse back upon him, and the last, diminished fragment of Tom Riddle's soul was finally extinguished from the world. The body of the Dark Lord lay broken, but the echoes of his ideology, and Grindelwald's before him, would linger in the silence that followed. After the last spell is cast and the last body is mourned, what remains? Not just the memory of the fallen, but the lessons they paid for in blood. We find ourselves now in a time of profound quiet, months after the final battle, walking through the grounds of a healing Hogwarts. We can hear the gentle tap of a mason's hammer against stone, the sound of magical mending, a low hum of restoration in the air. The scars on the castle walls are still visible, stark white lines against the ancient grey rock, and we see those same scars mirrored on the faces of the survivors, a quiet sorrow that has not yet learned how to leave their eyes. This is the silence where the echoes of 3 wars finally become clear. We began this journey by saying that for 75 years the magical world was tearing itself apart. Now, at the end of that journey, we can see it was not just tearing itself apart, it was forging something new in the fires of that destruction, a new understanding, paid for at an unbearable cost. This was never a story of 3 separate conflicts, but a single, continuous, 75-year struggle, a generational fever that broke, returned, and finally broke again. The core of this struggle was always the same seductive question: does power give you the right to rule? Let's trace the threads that weave this entire century together, because they are as intricate and as deliberate as a spell. We see how Grindelwald's youthful obsession with the Deathly Hallows led directly to Dumbledore possessing the Elder Wand. That one object, won in a duel of ideology in 1945, became the silent guardian of the wizarding world for the next 50 years. Its true allegiance, its hidden loyalty, was the piece of the puzzle Voldemort could never comprehend. He sought it as a weapon of ultimate force, blind to the fact that its power answered not to strength, but to the act of being defeated. and it was this profound misunderstanding that ultimately unmade him. We can now see the beautiful, terrible symmetry of it all. The story that began with a mother's love ended with a son's. Lily Potter's sacrifice was an act of pure, instinctual magic, a shield of love so powerful it could break an unbreakable curse. It was the first line of defense. Her love created a magic Voldemort, with his mutilated soul, could not touch and could not understand. And nearly 17 years later, her son Harry walked to his own death, not as a martyr, but as a soldier making a strategic choice, an act of love for the people he was protecting. His sacrifice was the final line of defense, the ultimate expression of the very power the prophecy foretold the Dark Lord would not know. Love was the first weapon, and it was also the last. At the center of this web, connecting every thread, stands Albus Dumbledore. He was not a flawless hero. His wisdom was forged in the fire of his own terrible mistakes. He was the man who first entertained the dream of the greater good, and he spent the rest of his life dismantling the nightmare it became. He understood Grindelwald because he had once shared his ambition. He understood Voldemort because he recognized the lonely, unloved orphan at the heart of the monster. He was the connecting figure, the master strategist, who played a game so long that most of the players never even knew their roles. His life serves as the ultimate testament to the core theme of this entire saga. It is not our abilities, but our choices, that show what we truly are. This 75-year conflict was, at its heart, one long civil war over a single poisonous idea: blood purity. Grindelwald gave this idea a philosophical, almost respectable veneer. He argued for a natural order, for wizards to take their rightful superior place over muggles for the greater good. It was a fascism of the supposedly enlightened, an argument for control disguised as benevolent stewardship. His was a war fought on a global stage, a conflict of grand armies and political movements. His ideology was an appeal to pride. Voldemort, however, took that same poison and distilled it into something far more personal and nihilistic. His obsession with blood purity was not a philosophy for the world. It was a desperate attempt to erase his own hated half-blood heritage. He didn't want to build a new world order. He wanted to achieve personal, eternal life and punish a world he felt had abandoned him. His war was not fought with armies, but with terror. It was a campaign of psychological demolition, using suspicion and fear to make society eat itself from the inside out. Grindelwald wanted to rule the world. Voldemort simply wanted to haunt it forever. His ideology was an appeal to fear. Both Dark Lords, these brilliant young men who twisted their gifts toward destruction, failed for the same fundamental reason. They saw love as a weakness. They dismissed loyalty and friendship as sentimental foolishness. They could not understand the strength in sacrifice, the power in allowing oneself to be vulnerable for the sake of another. And so, they were consistently outmaneuvered by a force they could not measure and therefore could not respect. The ultimate weapon against both of them was never a more powerful curse. It was the messy, illogical, and unbreakable bonds of human connection. It was the choice of a few ordinary people, time and again, to stand together. Let's consider the choices that defined this century. The choice Dumbledore made to turn away from power after the death of his sister, a decision that shaped his entire life. The choice Severus Snape made to turn spy, motivated not by ideology but by a painful, unrequited love. The choice Lily Potter made to stand in front of her son's crib. And finally, the choice Harry Potter made to walk into the forest, to lay down his life not in defeat, but in a final, quiet act of victory. This was never a story about destiny. The prophecy did not make Harry the chosen one. It was Voldemort's choice to believe it, and Harry's choice to see it through, that gave the words their power. We see how these conflicts expose the deep foundational cracks in magical society, the prejudice against Muggleborns, the marginalization of creatures like werewolves and house elves, the arrogance of the old pure-blood families. These were not problems created by Voldemort. They were the societal weaknesses he so brilliantly exploited. The wars forced a painful but necessary reckoning, a confrontation with the darkness that had been allowed to fester in their world for generations. The rebuilding we see at Hogwarts is not just about stone and mortar. It is the slow, difficult work of rebuilding a society on a new foundation, one that has finally learned that the purity of one's blood is meaningless compared to the purity of one's heart. And so, we can connect these themes to our own human experience. The story of Grindelwald is a timeless warning about the danger of charismatic leaders who promise a better world at the cost of your freedom and your compassion. The story of Voldemort is a stark reminder of how quickly a society can crumble when it allows fear and prejudice to turn neighbor against neighbor, and when it chooses the comfort of a lie over a difficult truth. These wars remind us that the most terrifying evil is often the one that tells you exactly what you want to hear, the one that gives you a target for your anger and a justification for your hatred. The courage of the Order of the Phoenix and Dumbledore's army shows us that resistance is often the work of a small few, armed with little more than their own conviction. They teach us that true strength is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. And the power of love and sacrifice, so central to this story, is not a magical concept. It is a universal truth, the force that drives a parent to protect a child, a friend to stand by a friend, and a citizen to fight for a stranger's freedom. These are the echoes that linger in the silence long after the battle is over. While Voldemort is gone, the ideas that created him are not so easily vanquished. The struggle between fear and love, between division and unity, is eternal. The wizarding world is safe, for now, but the story teaches us a final lesson in hopeful vigilance. It suggests that the price of peace is the memory of what it cost, and the willingness to see the shadows when they first begin to gather, not when they have already fallen. The temptation of power, the whisper of supremacy, the logic of us versus them, these are not monsters that can be killed. They are weeds that grow in the human heart, and they must be tended to, generation after generation. The world is left with a fragile quiet, a chance to be better, a future that is not written. And so, our journey through this shadow century comes to a close. But the story it tells is one that never truly ends.